Hi guys, this is a video on understanding language and imagery. An author crafts language carefully and in ways that can powerfully impact a reader's response to a text. We need to look for examples of language and imagery that an author might use because they can help influence the tone and style of writing, but also create specific meaning for a setting, character, or idea. This relates to symbolic meaning as well. When you look for examples in a text, we need to consider the language and imagery because it helps to create layers of meaning. So it's important to discuss these as you analyze either a singular or double text, where you might compare two texts to help demonstrate a more sophisticated understanding of those texts. You need to overall consider how they provoke a sense of time and place, but also might contribute to characterization and also help to think of how the reader is focusing on particular aspects of the story that the author wants them to think and feel, such as a climactic moment or turning point, but also gestures towards larger themes which might be more abstract, which might be explored through specific symbols that are repeated, known as motifs, that then help to convey a value and view of the text and the author. A simple example is of symbolism, whereby objects, characters, and figures, and even colors are used to represent more than their literal selves. A great example is a lion representing pride, a sunset representing the end of an era, or even if it was to rise, a new beginning, or something like a mask representing a hidden identity. So please consider what symbols might be used and represented within a text which reappear more than once and what they mean in relation to the themes of the text. A great example is of Nick Carraway from F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, whereby he recounts that the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckleburg are blue and gigantic. They look out of no face, but instead from a pair of enormous yellow spectacles which pass over a non-existent nose. Now, this is a description of Carraway describing as he enters the city on his way to meet friends and encounters the Great Gatsby himself, Jay Gatsby. But the imagery of the eyes looking over the city and judging people, but also remaining literally faceless, relates to the symbolism of identity that is explored in the story, and also hypocrisy and cruelty to others, which many of the rich folk, somewhat judge, including Carraway himself. So there's a symbol that is used by F. Scott Fitzgerald early on that is repeated throughout the story. Another great example is from William Golding's Lord of the Flies, which is about boys landing on an island with no adults and falling into savagery because there are no rules and order. But in the beginning, they try and have this rule and order and democracy, which is represented by them using a conch, which is a large shell, which they blow into to then have the boys sit silent. And the idea is that each of the boys hold the conch, they are allowed to speak. Ralph, in the middle of the story, recognizes that civilization is falling apart because the opposing side, led by another boy named Jack, are not listening, and he says to Piggy, a fellow friend, that if I blow the conch and they don't come back, then we've had it. We shan't keep the fire going. We'll be like animals. We'll never be rescued. And the symbolism there is that he acknowledges that if the children no longer listen to the conch, it is symbolic of them no longer listening to civilization and order. The fire itself being symbolic in terms of their fight for survival, but also Golding uses the eventual destruction of the conch at the hands of Jack and the boys, as the conch exploded into 1,000 white fragments and ceased to exist. The symbolic exaggeration of 1,000 white fragments represents that the reader now knows that civilization cannot be returned because the conch can never be rebuilt or put back together. It also symbolizes their loss of innocence as it is completely shattered, just like them. A motif then is a repeated symbol, but it doesn't have to be a physical object. It can be abstract, such as seasonal change. So in a story, consider about how a idea or action is repeated rather than an object reoccurring. But either way, these are motifs. So consider how they influence a theme and are repeatedly used. A great example of this is from the Harry Potter series throughout the novels, whereby a motif might be the scar on Harry's forehead, representing destiny, because he is destined to fight off and face Voldemort, but it also is a motif of the power of love of his family, which protected him. Another motif is Muggle-borns versus purebloods, which explores racism and tolerance. An allusion is then a direct reference to another text, so you might consider it to be a bit of an Easter egg, but this is why we study intertextuality in English, because it helps us understand how an author might be inspired by another text and wish to make reference to them, to acknowledge how they have influenced the text, or simply draw similar themes and connections. This might simply be based on historical context. So within Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, the young scout recounts that the Cunninghams are country folks, farmers, and the crash hit them the hardest. The crash that she is referring to isn't a literal crash of something falling, but the figurative crash of the stock market, which then brought upon the Great Depression across America. We then have the example from another short story known as The Monkey's Paw, whereby Sergeant Major Morris tells the whites, as he holds up the symbolism of the monkey's paw, which can grant 3 wishes, and he tells them that they are to wish aloud, but he warns them of the consequences, only then to have Mrs. White respond saying, "Sounds like Arabian Nights," which is a famous short story which was then adapted into the modern adaptation by Disney of Aladdin, whereby we have a character learn of the consequences of making 3 wishes because of his greed, which then leads to potential misfortune. Foreshadowing is then the idea of a text providing hints and clues before the events actually occur, which helps us to have insight as to what the author wants us to think and feel. It helps to remind us that this text is constructed. It doesn't just happen, but it might help explore a particular theme or idea that the author wants us to think about later on. So think about where a text might foreshadow an event. A great example of this is from Atticus Finch from Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, where as a prominent and well-respected lawyer in a very racist town, he says to his young children, "I wanted you to see what real courage is. Instead of getting the idea that courage is a man with a gun in his hand, it's when you know you're licked before you begin, but you begin anyway and see through it no matter what." Now, this is foreshadowing because Atticus Finch is giving advice to his children to stand up for what they believe in or to do what they know is right, even though they may know that it might not turn out the way that they want, which foreshadows Atticus taking on the role as defense lawyer for Tom Robinson, an African-American man who is wrongly accused of rape within the story, only for Atticus to defend him, knowing that it's not because he thinks he will win the case, which most lawyers would want, but because he thinks it is the right thing to do. So his words and advice to his children foreshadow what he eventually does heroically in the final chapters of the novel. We then can explore irony, which is in short words having an intended effect from their literal meaning or the exact opposite, and we can simply consider this to be in 3 different types. Situational irony, where actions or events have the opposite result from what is expected or what is intended. So we might consider a fire truck actually catching a light would be situational irony because their sole purpose is meant to stop a fire from happening, but they catch on fire. We then have verbal irony, is when someone says the exact opposite of what they really mean. So in context, we would call this sarcasm. So if you're being sarcastic. But most importantly of all, we have dramatic irony, where the audience or the viewer, because of the information that is either foreshadowed or mentioned prior to the event, are made aware of what is going to happen while the characters do not. This might also relate to what we are told by the omniscient or third-person narrator that the character simply is unaware of, but we see it unfold and they cannot see it. So that can create dramatic tension. Now, a quick example of situational irony is the idea of roaches or cockroaches infesting an office of a pest control service, because the very purpose of them is to stop infestations, only for them to return to find out that it's being infested themselves. The same idea could apply to a plumber who spends all his day working on leaky faucets, only to come home and find out that a pipe has burst in his home. Now, situational irony happens throughout Harry Potter, so if you want to read this example, please use the PowerPoint to explore it further. But moving on, verbal irony, we could simply categorize this as sarcasm, as previously mentioned, and something as simple as a mum saying to her son's messy room, "Wow, you could win an award for cleanliness," because she is being ironic because he is anything but clean. And if you want a further example, look to the PowerPoint as to how the opening lines from Romeo and Juliet uses verbal irony to suggest, although they are both dignified houses, they are actually the exact opposite because they are constantly fighting. We could then consider dramatic irony. A nice example is in many horror films where there is a murderer or a monster. We, the viewer, know of the monster's presence as to where they are. Meanwhile, the character is unassumingly unaware. And this helps to add further tension as to what is about to happen. So think about how a text might give information, whether it being described as to the character or setting, and the events that are unfolding, that we know what is going to happen, but the characters do not, which means they probably make poor choices or the wrong choice. Another example of dramatic irony comes from J.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, regarding the riddle between Bilbo Baggins and Gollum. So if you want to read a specific example, please head to the PowerPoint to read that. But more importantly, we need to focus on imagery. And I guess the examples that I'm about to go through shouldn't be new to you as English students, but just a kind reminder as to what specific examples you should look for within a written text specifically. Please note that in a film, you would be looking at cinematography, sound, lighting, mise-en-scène, as to how they are used to convey both the senses, but also figurative imagery, but just in a different text type. But more importantly, we might look at personification, which is whereby an object is given human qualities. And in this example from John Steinbeck's The Grape of Wrath, we have Steinbeck, or the narrator, write that the Western states were nervous under the beginning change. Then to describe that the land company, that's the banks, when it has land, wants tractors, not families on the land, and saying that the banks want the land suggests their greed. Meanwhile, using the term nervous to describe the Western states personifies the entire country being worried because they're poor and worried about the financial risk. In truth, many personified objects will simply be objects in a story that have human qualities, so look out for key adjectives or verbs that are used to describe an object and create some sort of human element to them. We then have onomatopoeia, which is a form of figurative language in which words are used to describe a sound that represent what they are being referred to. A simple example is that the ghost said boo, but more importantly, these can actually be specific words that help capture a moment and help us focus on the sensory detail of sound. And here's a great excerpt from one of my favorite novels, Christos Tikos's The Slap. So we have the narrator describe that Harry set him on the ground. The boy's face had gone dark with fury. He raised his foot and kicked wildly into Harry's shin. The speed was coursing through Hector's blood. Their hairs on his neck were upright. He saw his cousin's raised arm. It spliced the air, and then he saw the open palm descend and strike the boy. The slap seemed to echo. It cracked the twilight. The little boy looked up at the man in shock. There was a long silence. It was as if he could not comprehend what had just occurred, how the man's actions and the pain he was beginning to feel coincided. The silence broke. The boy's face crumpled. And this time there was no wail. When the tears began to fall, they fell silently. And what I like from this is that instead of really describing the slap that is directed towards the child by another person, it's simply described as the slap seemed to echo. So the word echo has that double syllable, which means to reverberate, but more importantly, it cracked the twilight to suggest how the sheer force or the moment not only symbolically interrupted the boy's play, but also caused him great pain, but also what was happening at the very barbecue in which this instance occurs. So just look for keywords that sound important, because that'll help focus on a key theme or idea or even turning point. We then have puns, which is in short a play on words, and if we look at Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, we could look at the example of Alice trying to show her intelligence to the Duchess by saying, "You see, the Earth takes 24 hours to turn round on its axis." whereby she's immediately cut off by the Duchess, where the Duchess using, or the author using the play on words says, "Talking of axes," said the Duchess, "chop off her head." So it's using that word to have more than its literal self, but kind of describing it in a way that represents something other than it is not. So here the play on words is axis as in the rotation of the earth, but then axes as in the physical device using to behead someone. We then have simile, which is probably one of the most important that you'll come across. It's whereby one thing is compared to another using like or as. So we might say as strong as an ox or as brave as a lion. In Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, we can simply look at this basic example of Offred saying, "I wait, washed, brushed, fed, like a prized pig." Now, within this very important novel that focuses on, I guess, women in society, where in this futuristic world they've had their rights entirely taken away from them and are completely or entirely used simply to give birth to children for those that can reproduce, the simile that is drawn here is that Offred sees herself like a prized pig, something that is more animal than human, but also being bred simply for the sole purpose or being used other than its own means, which also reinforces that she is being treated unfairly like an animal rather than human. We then have a metaphor, which I like to consider to be the bigger brother or sister of the simile, where a metaphor literally describes something as something it is not, even though in reality it is still not. So from Frank McCourt's memoir, Angela's Ashes, he describes or has a reflection where he says you have to study and learn so that you can make up your own mind about history and everything else, but you can't make up an empty mind. And I like that image of an empty mind, meaning that there's not much inspiration or ideas. So he says that he told himself to stock your mind, stock your mind. You might be poor, your shoes might be broken, but your mind is a palace. And here he's trying to conceptualize that his life has a large amount of potential so long as he believes in it, because his mind is like a palace, a great big expanse environment that is full of wonderful ideas and could potentially bring him riches beyond his belief, even though he is at that point poor. We also have alliteration, which is the repetition of letters or sounds that are used within one sentence. Typically, it is a consonant, not so much a vowel sound. So A, E, I, O, U, that's assonance. But a great example from The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald is Nick Carraway describing the idea of Gatsby, another character wanting to relive the past, and also having survived the war, fought against the tide, both in the literal sense of having to confront those on the shores, but the determination and struggle to recreate the past is conveyed by this simple sentence of, "So we beat on boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past," reflecting that repetition of the sound of the b, so beat, boats, borne back, showing that struggle that they're going to encounter. We then have hyperbole, which I quite like, which is an exaggeration. So if someone was to say, "My granddad is as old as time," that's actually a simile as well, but the exaggeration there is that nothing can be as old as time, but the reference is that the grandfather is quite old. And I like the hyperbole in Kurt Vonnegut Jr.'s famous novel Slaughterhouse-Five, where he writes, "It wasn't safe to come out of the shelter until noon the next day. When the Americans and their guards did not come out, the sky was black with smoke. The sun was an angry little pinhead." So I like that metaphor there. But he says Dresden was like the moon now, nothing but minerals. And although a simile, he is using the exaggeration that Dresden, a place, appears like the moon. So with its holes and its grey tones and its desolated energy, he's really exaggerating that Dresden, a place, has been absolutely destroyed and is no longer has earth qualities from the bombings. And he ends that paragraph or little statement with, "The stones were hot. Everybody else in the neighborhood was dead." So there's that prolific image of nothing having existed. After these basic ideas and, I guess, figurative descriptions of personification, onomatopoeia, metaphor, repetition, alliteration. Just always remember the 5 senses. So you want to look for examples where, whether it be in a written text or a visual text, we are referring to taste. So we might say the familiar tang of his grandmother's cranberry sauce reminded him of his youth. Or we might refer to sound. So the concert was so loud that her ears rang for days afterward. Sight. The sunset was the most gorgeous they'd ever seen. The clouds were edged with pink and gold. Smell. After eating the curry, his breath reeked of garlic. Or touch. The tree bark was rough against her skin. An author won't always use all these senses in one go, but think about when they are used and why, and what that helps you focus upon as the reader to understand the significance of that moment into the aspect of what theme or idea it might explore. There are many more techniques to this, and this is a lot of information to take on board, so don't panic, but simply try to look for at least 3 or 4 throughout the text that you might compare and help to reinforce how they explore a theme or an idea. Once again, we're trying to unpack these and find the reason why we need to study them. It's because so you as the reader are able to explore the writer's craft and how they create a broader meaning to the text that they are writing. Remembering that a text isn't just written for enjoyment, but to have more than its symbolic meaning in itself. So the questions that we can consider after all this are simply, what images appear within a text? What are they associated with, such as are they associated with a character or a setting, and what do they represent? Whether or not these images have a positive or negative association based on what the reader understands of them and why. Are any of these images symbolic, and if so, what do they symbolize in their literal self? And how might they convey the text themes and values? So please consider these questions as you explore a text and consider how language and imagery is used by the author. Once again, I'd like to thank you for watching this video and remind you to refer to the PowerPoint for further details and examples. Thanks.